heard. And so, for example, at the meeting on Thursday and Friday, which Dr. Murphy and many of students of FDU will be attending, there are three ways that we are addressing ourselves. Number one, what do we ask ourselves as NGOs? We make specific demands, and we urge governments and and the United Nations to do things. What we are doing on Thursday and Friday will be three things. What do we ask ourselves as NGOs? Number two, what do we ask of member states? And number three, what do we ask of United Nations with respect to the issue of global public health, which is this year's theme of the annual session of the ECOSOC. So you can measure accomplishment both in the singular accomplishments of an NGO like FDU, or in the multiple voices joined together under the umbrella, for example, of CoNGO.
Yes, but that question is a very valid question. And I think we have to pay greater attention to self-criticism, both of governments and of civil society.
Agree.
If you look at the best way of looking at NGOs in the UN is to examine what lobbies are doing in Washington. They are also NGOs, and they are far more successful than NGOs at the UN because they make life miserable for Congress. And so you see in the current health debate how the NGOs, civil society, which is the representatives of industry in this case, have really networked, prepared reports, made it extremely difficult for the President and the Congress to move forward on healthcare reform.
Well,
And so I don't see you making my life as miserable as you should. And so that is my problem. I think you are just hot air. And that's it. You come out with a statement and you think you've achieved something. You've achieved nothing. Because in the test of the pudding is in the eating. And you are not really achieving. So the question is, what are you achieving actually?
Let me try to complexify even further. I like the way Ambassador Kamal put it already with respect to NGO being self-critical. And I think, as I said, there have been drafted documents of a code of ethics, for example, for non-governmental organizations, in not only how they must deal with each other, but also in how they express what they profess to be independence, accountability, and transparency for what makes the integrity that NGOs, call of governments, must also address themselves. To complexify the issue, one, NGOs can either be co-opted or being cooperative. So the co-optation and cooperation are two dynamics that are always very hard to quantify and even qualify. But there are examples of those within the NGO community. Again, individual NGOs lobby their own governments, and then for their efficacy and for their loud voice and good action, or a mix of those three, they eventually get co-opted. There are governments who eventually put NGOs in their official UN delegation. That itself has changed the configuration of non-governmental representation when an official governmental presence at a specific UN meeting includes non-governmental organization. That to me is an issue of co-optation. Whether they have sold their soul, it's another matter. And therefore, peer NGOs need to check on NGOs of their own nature, so that the co-optation is not a matter of selling out, but being able to coordinate and harmonize. So co-optation and cooperation. The other one would be the issue of homogenization or harmonization. Homogenization would be that NGOs, governments, and the UN would say, wouldn't it be nice if we are all on the same page? That's good in rhetoric, but there is no, when a voice becomes one, and there is no NGO and there's no other entity to challenge conventional wisdom or received wisdom, then NGOs will have lost their efficacy and their voice. And so we have to be wary of the call for harmonization of views and a unanimity in calls to action, which itself can lead to the homogenization. Globalization is an act of homogenization, and look where it has brought us.
Over to Bronx for a question from that end. Second round.
Now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Hi. Just had a quick question. Having worked personally as part of the PRT team for Afghanistan and also in Iraq with several NGOs, was just curious to see or to hear, excuse me, what the UN and CoNGO plans to do going forward to work with groups such as the Independent Women's Forum, which is an NGO that's active in Afghanistan, there to promote women's issues, not say just voting, but education, healthcare, religious freedom, etc. Thank you.
Let me take that first, and then I want your answer also, because this is, in a way, a follow-up to a question which was asked by Lee Hai in the first round, and I should have given the response to that in a more detailed fashion. The question was the field work of NGOs. Now, please understand that the United Nations basically is a very small organization. The total strength of the UN is in a few thousand workers, and that's it. And so it cannot really do things fully in the field. And so it is heavily dependent on non-governmental organizations out in the field. When I was the president of the High Commission for Refugees, we had a budget of more than $1 billion. 80% of that budget was being spent by us through NGOs, because we did not have the capacity, we didn't have the staff to do the actual work out in the field ourselves. We were just a few hundred people in the High Commission for Refugees. And so great help was given by non-governmental organizations working in the field. The same is true of the World Health Organization. It is a very small organization with a very small budget. The total budget of the WHO is, I think, 150 or something like that $1 million. It can do nothing, but it has succeeded. The greatest success of the UN, the greatest success in 64 years of its existence, has been the complete elimination of smallpox from the world, a killer disease which has killed more than 30 million people. How was it done? With the help of NGOs. Once again, we are in a global program to get rid of polio. That is again being done through NGOs. The World Food Program distributes food, not itself, but with the help of NGOs. So NGO contribution in the field is critically important to the delivery of the United Nations. Most people don't know it. In fact, the UN itself does not know it, because it says, we did it. Nonsense. We did not do it. We got the help of Mr. Bautista in doing it. And that is why, once again, we have to realize the importance of NGOs in actual delivery. Over to you for additional points.
I like the question, and it's very important. The role of NGOs in the field. The Chief of Staff of CoNGO, which is based in the CoNGO office in Geneva. CoNGO has 3 offices based in New York, Geneva, and Vienna. The larger part of the CoNGO Secretariat is based in Geneva. The Chief of Staff of CoNGO was a former representative of World Food Program in Afghanistan and in Iran. So I take a lot of advice and from his expertise. And when you are an NGO working on the ground, one has to realize that local forces are in fact much more important to reckon with than when you are acting in the international. You're dealing with local landlords, with local political lords, with local warlords, and therefore, by the way, that is where NGOs can be unduly described as gongos, precisely because when you are on the ground and in a population